So in Throne and Liberty, I've been playing a lot of the new spear, and I've been wanting to compare it versus the crossbow, as that's the original weapon I started playing with. Both of them I pair with the dagger, as they synergize super well. Now I've made extensive builds for both crossbow and dagger, and also spear and dagger. I've done a ton of testing, figuring out what setups are the best, what rotations for both as well, for both PvE and PvP, and you can check out all my previous videos on that too. So first of all, let's cover PvE content. Which do I think performs better and which will I mainly be using moving forward? What's really nice is that the builds in terms of gear are pretty much identical. On both spear and crossbow, you want to be going for that attack speed, the buff duration, the cooldown speed, and also all that critical damage. So you can pretty much use the identical gear and min-max on both. So the big change is going to be your playstyle and the actual skills you are going to be using. Now the main PvE content is going to be your dungeons, 1-star, 2-stars, and then also your dimensional trials to farm runes. And so the most important damage to have is single target damage, to beat up those specific bosses as quickly as possible. For crossbow and dagger, my suggestion is a power setup like this with the specializations on those skills exactly like this. Be aware, instead of ankle strike for team support, depending on the boss, you can run weak point shot, giving you and your entire team the crit damage. It's just you have to wait for the boss to do a fury attack before you can actually use weak point, otherwise it has no effect. My suggested rotation with that is, yes, an order of 23 skills. It's pretty extensive, and you can look at not just my own representations of this, but other people as well, like this guy. Check his video out. Some nuts amount of damage there on like a dummy, proving it's not just me who can perform like this. But I do not envy the amount of time this probably took this guy in order to get such a perfect run. His rotation's very similar to this, although it's slightly different because on a dummy you can use the Gate of Infinity rotation, where you do take advantage of weak point shot, and you can see the full setup of that here with the specializations on quest log as well. You can't use that on co-op dungeons because you can't use the combination of the bind plus the expand conditions on weak point shot. Now in order to compare the damage output against bosses of crossbow and dagger versus spear and dagger, you'll find your maximum to be about 450,000 damage here. With this full rotation, perhaps a little bit more with the Gate of Infinity rotation, and you can confirm again with this guy. So remember that. 450,000 is about your peak damage you're going to find on crossbow and dagger. However, there's something you need to keep in mind. Crossbow and dagger has a lot of randomness. You're not always going to fulfill this entire rotation because of the chances behind that. Your damage can get absolutely gutted as soon as you aren't lucky. What do I mean by this? Well, you have these things called offhand attacks, and these can basically cause your skills to give you their bonuses twice. A big example is Detonation Mark. This can deal 80% of all the damage you've dealt over the duration, so if you aren't lucky and don't get the offhand trigger, you're losing 40% damage just from this ability. So now you go from your full rotation dealing 450,000 to just 350,000. A massive damage loss. And then to add to that, if you do not get the offhand activation with Thunderclad's bombings, you can't follow up with the second one so quickly. So you could end up this rotation only doing 2 Thunderclad bombings instead of 4. So again, we can say our maximum damage output on a burst rotation is about 450,000, but our average is going to be a good bit less than that, down to like 300,000, because you won't always get lucky and get those offhand weapon attacks. On top of each of those offhand weapon attacks being able to then heavy attack. And so a perfect run, like what this guy got on the dummy test, is going to have nearly all of the hits offhand attacking and then nearly all of those hits heavy attacking. But the average amount of heavy attacks, the average amount of offhand attacks on all of your hits and all all of your skills is definitely going to reduce your damage down to what I would safely say as about 300,000. So now let's compare that with Spear and Dagger. What's the average amount of damage we're getting on, say, a dummy test versus what we're getting on a dummy test on Crossbow and Dagger with this 16-step setup? That is, yes, quite a few less steps than Crossbow and Dagger. So you can already see you're not going to have to do as much button mashing. But additionally, your damage output is a lot more consistent because you're not relying on, say, offhand triggers to actually get that full rotation done properly. Every single step here, you can guaranteed perform. Now there is alternative rotations here using, say, Explosive Fury. It performs nearly as good as the Brutal Fury setup, and I did make a video covering that, and Freshy did also follow up with a correction as I did make an error. And ultimately, if you aren't following, my error was with regards to Brutal Fury. Basically, you can use this 3 times as long as you have 5 burst stacks. And getting this conditional hit doesn't actually add another hit when you already have those 3 times from having 5 burst stacks. There's a bit of confusion there with myself, thinking that you would normally gain only +1 by having 5 burst stacks and plus another one by having Abyssal Cleave plus the specialization. Basically, the specialization is actually kind of pointless if you've got 5 burst stacks. So I had a bit of confusion there. Again, this is the full rotation I recommend. You'll generally do this back to back, and you will find this in quest log just right here, the skill setup with those specializations. And keep in mind, another correction was you can use Rising Slash instead of Slaughtering Slash in single target, as they have the same effect. You just have to cast Rising Slash twice. That allows you to put those specialization points into, say, Fatal Stigma here, Inject Venom, minor damage boosts. But ultimately, comparing the two then, Crossbow and Dagger versus Spear and Dagger in PvE boss fights, we find Spear and Dagger is about 300,000 damage, and Crossbow and Dagger is also about 300,000 average. Peak is about 450,000. You can definitely output better burst damage on Crossbow and Dagger if you have the luxury of retrying, which is Gate of Infinity. If you don't get lucky, you just retry and go for a better completion time. In co-op dungeons, 2-star dungeons, you're looking for more reliability. You consistently want to be doing good damage. And so we bring down that average to about 300,000, which again matches what we get on Spear and Dagger. So what would I play between the two? Ultimately, my personal preference is most definitely Spear and Dagger. It just feels far better. It's an easier play style. You can play hybrid and still do a ton of single target damage and have massive amounts of multi-target. About the best multi-target damage in the game right now of any weapon combo. We'll talk a bit more later about multi-target damage, but you can check quest log for my skills, the specializations, and links to my video where I covered that. You can argue Crossbow and Dagger is better for the team because of weak point shot. This at max is 21% extra critical damage when cast on a boss during a fury attack. That can make or break some completion times, and so for meta groups, for min-max, Crossbow and Dagger can be more favored. For Crossbow and Dagger, a quick tip, you can use Umbral Spirit instead of, say, Mother Nature's Protest. You should be able to perform this rotation similarly due to getting the extra Thunderclad stacks from Umbral Spirit instead of just Mother Nature's, and it will save you a ton in terms of mana. So ultimately, my conclusion for PvE boss fights is that Crossbow and Dagger has higher peak damage, but it's a little bit less consistent. But that's still not to say Spear and Dagger is very good, very reliable, and does output very high damage. But definitely, it's a much higher skill ceiling. The average player, I think, will just perform worse on Crossbow and Dagger versus just Spear and Dagger. Spear and Dagger is just so much easier to play and still very high damage output. But now I want to give my thoughts and opinions on PvP. Which do I prefer and which do I find more effective? And I will say definitely, I find Spear Dagger to just be far, far better. And why? Well, because utility and the ability to actually have some crowd control. You have Tempest Strike, which can knock down enemies and stun them. You have Abyssal Cleave. You can knock them down with a specialization, but also stun them. Versus Crossbow, which literally has no CC other than a bit of a pushback, and potentially a bind with Wind Snatcher, which just isn't great. Both of them will use Dagger, so no arguments there, and Dagger is what brings the excellent support with invisibility, Phantom Smoke Screen, just dodging all those attacks. Ankle Strike can be used for a prone effect, but while combining it with Spear, you don't really need that, as you're using Tempest Strike for your prone effect. If you aren't aware, you will Shadow Strike to bind them, and then Tempest Strike will prone them. You can do the same with following up with Ankle Strike, but that's single target versus Tempest Strike, a large area. And then just looking at damage output, Spear feels an absolute ton better. You can absolutely nuke groups of enemies with Javelin Inferno, and you can use it far more often than you can use Annihilation Barrage Shot on the crossbow. This is going to be your main damage ability on crossbow. You're going to jump in and then spin and nuke everybody. Just the issue is it's a channel ability. It doesn't happen instantly. People can easily interrupt you, and they will use abilities like Phantom Smoke Screen to just completely counter you. As soon as a crossbow jumps on you, they start spinning, you pop this down, and they deal 0 damage. All the projectiles completely absorbed. Alternatively, you just use a bit of a stun ability, poof, they can't do a thing. Or a Sword and Shield activates counter barrier, and you kill yourself. Ultimately, there are far too many counters for Annihilation Barrage Shot, and people have gotten used to those crossbow and dagger bombers, and they just easily counter it. Pretty much every weapon combination has a counter to it one way or another, and ultimately you can just use your defense skill and also mitigate all that damage. But yes, you will see clips. You will see people absolutely nuking massive groups of people with this, with the Annihilation Barrage Shot, because they were under-geared, they were new players, inexperienced, not aware of their surroundings, and were just caught off guard. As soon as people get good, this skill becomes pretty pointless. Now for Spear Dagger, you can check out what I recommend for the PvP setup. Still experimenting around a little bit, but yes, having that Javelin Inferno is absolutely massive, and there does seem to be a bug right now where the chained javelins don't seem to be affected by, say, evasion, and so you easily hit with those, and then just being able to have the stuns feels great. Death from above is the hyped up skill that Spear came with, but it honestly is a bit underwhelming. Still has its uses. You can catch people off guard with this, and it can be quite funny, but it is a bit of a meme ability. Potentially I will switch off using it and go with like Umbral Spirit or Bloodleech Aura instead, or even Fatal Stigma. This can be a very good ability, preventing enemies from getting healed and just nuking them. But with regards to crossbow and dagger and PvP, pretty much the best and all-rounder I could find was this setup right here. You have that spin to win ability, which still can sometimes work, especially backed up with area damage from other players. And then you do have a bit of single target damage. You can jump on somebody with Shadow Strike and prone them and put detonation mark in them before you jump in, as well as Fatal and Stigma. And you can pretty much guarantee to kill on somebody. But that's like one guy, and then you're waiting for your cooldown, your massive cooldown on Annihilation Barrage before you can go and bomb somebody again. And in all likelihood, when you go for that bomb on somebody with this ability, you're going to end up dead because they'll kill you. There isn't much of a get out after that, because you have to sacrifice the prep of going there with camouflage cloak so they don't see you, popping down the Phantom Smoke Screen, and then spinning to kill everybody. But ultimately, I find, yes, Spear Dagger to just, it feels far better in PvP. You feel far more useful with having some stuns and area effect ones at that with your Tempest Strike, along with having some extra survivability with Bastion, being able to give yourself a nice shield, and you can even play around a Cataclysm in small scale. It's quite funny to just disable their block ability or stun them if they try block your attack. If they get good at perfect blocking you, you put this on them and then they get stunned anywhere and they're like, what happened? But a last note would be dungeon farming, so open world, Silas Abyss like right here, 100% Spear feels 10 times better than crossbow. You actually have some decent survivability with the shield and then a ton of multi-target damage to be able to kill everything. Like, you can easily solo farm here on Spear and Dagger and just, yeah, everything melts. It's so good. So if you are a crossbow and dagger main, haven't considered switching to say using Spear, I would highly recommend seeing how it is. At least for mob farming and PvP, I find it far better in single target. If you want to min-max against those bosses, potentially going in the trials and getting up to the insane tiers, crossbow and dagger is still very, very powerful, and you will find it performing a bit higher in terms of peak damage output than what you can get on Spear and Dagger. And you'll find that similarly in, say, Gate of Infinity. Crossbow and Dagger can generally perform better if you look at the rankings than Spear Dagger. For example, 24 seconds in this latest one, and you look at Crossbow and Dagger, 10 seconds. That's not to say these rankings are all that accurate, because some bosses can just be stun locked, some classes have a bit more front loaded damage and then higher cooldowns, and ultimately I feel Gate of Infinity needs some adjustments if they want it to be an area where people compare weapons versus each other. Ultimately, it's not really designed for that. You're supposed to just compare within the same weapon types. But yes, you do have the option to see others. Ultimately, I hope this helps. My comparisons, there'll be links in the video description below. You can find my spear builds here with all the different skill setups, and then also the ones for crossbow and dagger with those skill setups, and be aware of the different rotations. So this is a single target rotation with explosive fury. This is a hybrid damage rotation with explosive fury, so you're killing groups of enemies and say your boss. And then this is a single target damage rotation using, say, the burst setup with brutal fury. Can perform a little bit better than explosive fury and definitely a lot less mana consuming. Do recommend checking it out. And then the crossbow and dagger rotations here for your boss fights, and then also say Gate of Infinity. Now, a quick bug you might want to abuse is that Stigma can actually benefit from both Thunderclads and Poison stacks, despite the description saying the user's Poison or Thunderclads. So we need to use this effect accumulation to get those Thunderclads from Cleaving Moonlight here, which then you can see the specializations I'm using, and now these ones here, and it's the same on Questlog. I have that updated. So once again, thanks for watching. A special thank you to the support of my channel members, and we'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.